Hello there. I was going to do a review for this book, Knight of Knives, by Ian C. Esslemont, a novel of the Malazan Empire. Okay, so this is part of the whole Malazan saga or world, the overall fantasy series, the main part of which is Stephen Erikson's 10-book series, Malazan Book of the Fallen. And then as a kind of supplement to that, you have the Ian C. Esslemont books, of this being the first one, which are all under the label Novel of the Malazan Empire. The way the two series go together is interesting, and it kind of raises the issue you'll have as to where or when you want to read this book, and I guess other Ian Esslemont books, in relation to the main series, which is all written by Erikson. Some people will actually say, don't bother with the Ian Esslemont books. Actually, I think he gets kind of a bad rap in a lot of reviews I've seen online. Some of it seems kind of harsh, but we'll maybe discuss the merits of that, or lack thereof, a little later. For now, when you first kind of look at Knight of Knives, you wonder, well, when should I read it? It would be a bad book to read at the very beginning, and it came out quite a few years after Erikson was already rolling with the main series. I think it came out after either the fourth or fifth book in Malazan Book of the Fallen. And it's actually a prequel, sort of, to the first book of the main series, Gardens of the Moon. So Knight of Knives, it's a prequel. You don't want to read it first. But some people will say read it after Midnight Tides, which is the fifth book in the main series. And of course, in my case, I read this right after Gardens of the Moon, so it was the second Malazan book I read. The reason I think some people have said not to do that is because there's a few giveaways in Knight of Knives, I think, that you would get earlier than you would get them otherwise by just reading the Malazan Book of the Fallen. One of them is, I guess, other details about the the Emperor and his right-hand man, Dancer. The other one is learning a little more detail about what happened to Dassem Ultor, who is a character mentioned in Gardens of the Moon. He's the guy who they mention as being killed in like some far-off city or some far-off battle, and they haven't found his body yet. And you learn a little bit more about what happened in that situation in Knight of Knives before you would, of course, in Malazan Book of the Fallen, if you read this book as the second book like I did. And like I said, that's why some people would say, don't read it that soon. But as I've read into the main series, I found that it seems the way certain things are revealed in this book is almost cooler, for lack of a better term, than the reveals in the main series. And it also kind of sets up this situation where, because you know some of these things from Book of Knives, you end up knowing a bit more about certain events than the characters do, which is an unusual advantage in Malazan, because you normally from the beginning you're just dropped into these crazy situations and you kind of have to piece it together as you're moving along. Like, it's not like a slow farm boy adventure quest, and he slowly learns about the world as the reader does. So it's kind of interesting to actually know a little more about something than the characters do in some situations. But for example, there's a theory in Gardens of the Moon that seems pretty plausible when they discuss something about Emperor and Dancer. And that theory is confirmed in this book. Now in Dead House Gates, a character kind of has this moment where they're like, oh yeah, they figure it out. But it's cooler to find out the confirmation of that theory the way it happens in this book than that book. And then there's another thing, like I said, about Dassem Ultor. Okay, so you know he was killed in a battle, and you don't really know why or what happened. You know he had some connection to the god of death, Hood, and it's kind of mysterious. You get a little more detail on what happened there, and it's pretty interesting, and I think it sets up kind of this promise of something really crazy that's going to happen that kind of hangs over you as you're reading the main books, because you know at some point these other characters in the main series are going to interact with the situation that's discussed with reference to the whole Dassem Ultor thing. But you don't know when, you just know it's going to be crazy when it happens. So that's cool. That's like kind of a dramatic irony thing where builds up this anticipation and tension, and it's arguably would make reading it more fun. Maybe not. Maybe there's no right or wrong answer. That's just maybe one way of looking at it in favor of reading Night of Knives right after Gardens of the Moon. But anyway, Night of Knives, as a standalone book, it's good, and as a way it adds to the kind of Malazan fantasy history world building is pretty interesting overall. It adds a lot of new facts or knowledge about some things you've heard about before. It introduces some new things that seem like they're going to be important maybe in the other books. So it's pretty interesting that way. And as you know, like, the coolest thing about Malazan is the way it builds up all this detail and kind of rich artificial history, and the backstory and the lore to the world is really interesting, and they just jam everything so full of cool stuff. Again, like, the cool factor is very high in these books. Instead of getting bogged down with details about people and things and events you don't really care about, Erikson and Esslemont here do a pretty good job making everything seem pretty interesting, so you don't really resent the fact when it goes off on, like, filling in details that maybe aren't immediately critical, but the way they weave things together and things interrelate and cross-reference each other is very interesting. So Esslemont adds that to the Malazan experience with this book, but on a smaller scale. Like, this book is tiny, 300 pages. I mean, I got Dead House Gates here. Like, there's a pretty big size difference here, and Dead House Gates is one of the smaller Malazan books. Oh, I'm all mixed up here. Okay, so two things, like I said, as a standalone book, like, its own story is good. The world building's good. I'm talking about that first part now. The individual story is basically kind of like this old veteran guy on the one hand, and this, I don't know, kind of like Nightcrawler girl. She's kind of like young, naive, adventurous, and kind of hot-headed maybe. and basically they get mixed up in like these big epic events that are kind of bigger than them. And it's pretty interesting. Like, it's on a much smaller scale. The whole thing takes place in basically one location and kind of some other dimensions in a way, or one pretty small geographical area, like a little bit out on the sea, and then in the main city of the story. And quite a bit fewer characters, of course. The book is smaller, and it focuses on basically like a day, mostly one crazy night. And the story is basically, there's this event called the Shadow Moon, and when it happens, kind of speaking generically, kind of like the shadow world and the real world get mixed up a little bit, and crazy stuff happens. For kind of a smaller scale story where it's not like the big war, there is some epic stuff going on, and then there's kind of like the smaller stories. They're pretty good, and I think what's interesting about this, it's very atmospheric, but not the way Erikson's books were atmospheric. Erikson's book had this like dark, dreadful atmosphere, but it was about wars or impending wars or battles. And this is kind of like a horror element to this book, where this Shadow Moon event is happening, and you get kind of like some shadow monster stuff and some undead stuff and some creepy, weird environment stuff. And it's pretty well written. Like, it's not scary, but it's got a good vibe, and it's creepy. It sets up a good atmosphere, and you read through it, and it's cool. Then, really, the main reason I wanted to read this so quickly is because it deals with some of the questions about the Emperor and Dancer, and it does fill in a lot of that, which is very interesting. And like I said, it's interesting going forward, knowing some of these things. You get a little bit more, you see a little bit more of Surly, later known as Lysine, the new Empress, which I think is interesting because you don't see too much of her in Gardens of the Moon, but she is obviously behind a lot of stuff on the Malazan side. And then there's, some crazy battles against some hardcore dudes, and that's good. All that stuff I thought was pretty well done. And there's shadow cults, and I don't know, there's these crazy Storm Rider guys who are coming in from the ocean, and they're so powerful, and it takes like the most powerful guys to stop them, and that's kind of just happening in the background. There's a lot of interesting stuff on the shadow world that people see, and I think it also builds on the whole dead house thing, which is mentioned near the very end of Gardens of the Moon. So that's interesting as well. It builds on the whole lore and background in an interesting way. So overall, like, this is honestly really good. I don't know why Esslemont gets the bad reviews. There seems to be a lot of naysayers out there, but this is good Malazan material. I think you'll benefit a lot by reading it. You don't really have too much to lose. I mean, if you're already committed to Malazan and it's 1,000 book monsters, then, this is 300 pages. You can burn through it pretty quick. It's great, honestly. Read it after Gardens of the Moon. I recommend that. And if not, just try to read it at some point. Don't read it first, though. Good book. Talk to you later, maybe in some other Malazan book reviews. Bye for now.